Bueno, buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a esta nueva sesión.
We are together to show our solidarity with our brothers and sisters of Palestine. For those who do not know me, I am the Vice Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Diego Pasmiño. I was the Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations in New York until very recently. I give this background because my attachment to the issue of Palestine is not artificial. It's in my heart, and we very much support our brothers and sisters from Palestine, and Ambassador Mansour having been able to hold this meeting in Quito as part of this policy of solidarity that the Ecuadorian government shows in each of its actions. This afternoon, we are ready to resume our deliberations with the last plenary session of our meeting, entitled The Role of Non-Governmental Actors in Latin America and the Caribbean in Promoting a Permanent Settlement to the Conflict. I have distinguished speakers with me at the lead table that have been kind enough to come and share their valuable experiences and knowledge with us. Once their addresses have concluded, I will give the floor to the participants to ask questions or to make comments. Before beginning, I should like to also indicate to you that there will be a change in the program of this United Nations meeting, the closing session. We have the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ecuador, His Excellency Ricardo Patiño, will address the closing session. His role is important. He assigns a great deal of importance to the committee, and he wished to conclude this meeting, but he had to be at a meeting of UNASUR in Caracas. He wishes to be with us tomorrow so that he can personally close the session then. So I have the pleasure of changing the program today in order to be able to be with the foreign minister tomorrow. And of course, for all of us, that is a great honor. So we have a bit broader of timetable for our discussion today. Presentations should be limited to 15 minutes so that there is enough time for discussion. But I think that with the change that I've just mentioned regarding the foreign minister's schedule, I think we can expand the time frame. People come from so very far with topics so very important, and we, the moderators, have to end up giving them time limits, which seems absolutely unjust. So we will try to make sure everyone's happy. The first expert in the program for this plenary was Mr. Imad Jada, Ambassador of the State of Palestine to Chile. Unfortunately, for reasons beyond his control, he has not been able to join us for this meeting in Quito. He has, however, submitted his paper, which fits perfectly in our session this afternoon, entitled Civil Society as a Central Pillar in the Search for Genuine and Lasting Peace. We very much appreciate Ambassador Jada, who has been kind enough to send along copies of his presentation. You can find it on the document distribution table. The Secretariat has made copies available of that at that desk. So, the first speaker of this plenary will be Ms. Arlene Elizabeth Clemesha. She is a professor of Arab history at the Center for Arab Studies at the Universidad de São Paulo. Ms. Clemesha authored and compiled numerous publications on the question of Palestine, as well as translating several of Edward Said's works. She has organized in Brazil and abroad courses and lectures on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Madam, we thank you for your participation, and you do have the floor.
Ahora sí. Empiezo por...
I'd like to start by thanking the committee on the exercise of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people for this invitation and for holding this important conference. And I also like to thank the Division on Palestinian Rights, which has worked so hard. in order to make this conference possible. And I'd like to extend my greetings to the Excellency ambassadors from the United Nations, Ambassador Mansour to the UN, and the ambassador to Brazil, my country, for Palestine, and the ambassador of Brazil to Ecuador. I had the great pleasure of hearing his message as well. And I extend my greetings to the delegation of Brazil that are present here. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, scholars, parliamentarians, even those from Brazil who weren't able to come send their greetings. Mr. Eduardo Suplicy asked me to convey his regrets that he wasn't able to be here, but he is with us in spirit at this event. And if I may, I'd like to apologize for my very poor Spanish. And I will be doing as others have done, which is to speak the language of the future, which is the subcontinent language of Portuñol, a mixture of Portuguese and Spanish. Now, we are meeting today in the context of solidarity with the Palestinian people. This solidarity is increasingly important given the failure of the United Nations system and the international community in making it possible for their inalienable rights to be exercised. Rights such as the right to national self-determination, national sovereignty, the right to return, and respect of their basic human rights. The 14 points of Woodrow Wilson, which in 4 years will be celebrating their 100th anniversary. And after 100 years, the Palestinians continue to not have access. Horrifically, the dynamic which explains the exclusion of the Palestinians from being a full member of the Club of Nations is an old one that goes back to, and as old as the very idea of the right to universal national self-determination. In other words, it's a dynamic of dehumanization for the purposes of colonization. We would also remember that almost 100 years ago, Saad Salgul from Egypt and Faisal from Damascus were both prevented from negotiating the independence of their respective countries at the Paris Peace Conference after the First World War. And the idea at that time, which was used to justify this exclusion, was that Arabs were not ready for self-government. They were not capable. They were not part of the civilized world. That was the justification. So they were put on a level of inferiority, and they were put under one of the not very gracious imperial domains of the French and the British, and were forced out of the League of Nations, which would include the British Mandate of Palestine from 1922 to 1947. Now, so many years have elapsed, and so much progress has been made in the area of human rights and international law. The dehumanization of the Palestinians in order to maintain their status of subjugation cuts even deeper now. The Palestinians resist the illegal occupation of their territories, be it peacefully through demonstrations in Bilin, or be it by throwing stones at armored tanks, or other nonviolent actions such as boycotts, are implicitly presented as terrorist actions supposedly endangering the existence of the State of Israel. We do not deny that there are acts of violence that take place, as well as acts of terrorism practiced by Palestinians against Israel, and these acts should not be tolerated, and they should be condemned. Having said that, however, we condemned the attempt to distort reality and hide the fact that the first violence was that of occupying Palestine, and that there is ongoing and incessant violation of Palestinian human rights. The occupation of the West Bank and Gaza is maintained on the one hand through the use of brute force and weapons, and on the other hand, the injection of $3 billion annually. Moreover, it is done through the attempt to confirm this whole system by using a system of occupation which includes walls, checkpoints, and all sorts of violence and violation of human rights and collective punishment, all necessary to guarantee the security of Israel, supposedly threatened by a people which has been described in recent months as having a tendency towards violence, being fanatic, and given to terrorism. Ultimately, what we're talking about is a perverse process of criminalization of the victim and victimization of the occupying power, with the sole purpose of hiding the ongoing and continuous advancing of the settlements and the annexation, the de facto annexation of Palestinian lands and extraction of their natural resources. This process doesn't seem to have any limits. There's none in sight, at least. If in the 1970s to 1980s the PLO was denied the right to resist, and Yasser Arafat at the time was painted as the Arab terrorist, and the Palestinians were seen all as violent and described as such, even when their resistance was peaceful, such as the first boycott movement, the participation of women during the first Intifada would be examples of that. Today, when the Palestinians were all described in the same way, painted with the same brush, today what we see is that they have proven that they want to negotiate for peace. But then it seems that there's another group that's then promoted to the status of Arab terrorists, Hamas. They are conveyed as an expression of violence, innate violence, which is then generalized to the entire Palestinian people, serving the supposed excuse that ultimately Palestinians don't want peace, but rather the destruction of the State of Israel. This is used as a justification, ultimately, to maintain the system of occupation and to continue with all sorts of violation of human rights and everything that we're describing here. Ultimately, the system of occupation and the current Israeli government actually need Hamas. In fact, they need Hamas as much as Hamas needs them in order to maintain their own fundamentalist regime, their own regime of oppression, oppressing the punished people of Gaza, in order to break this dynamic, which is harmful for all those who wish to see peace in the region, be they Arabs or Jews, or be they abroad. That's when we see reference to solidarity at all levels. This is what's needed to break the dynamic. If we look at civil society, and specifically the young people, the involvement of Palestinians and Jews working side by side along with people from abroad in specific actions that are geared to fighting the occupation in the name of application of international humanitarian law. And we see this, for example, in campaigns against products coming out of the settlements, or campaigns waged against businesses that are operating out of these settlements. The power of this collective, nonviolent, solidarity-based action, which is specifically targeting those companies which are making money from the occupation, has been the only action which showed that it was possible of actually undermining the occupation system. And participation based on solidarity of alls, including Israeli Jews, non-Israelis, all involved together in these campaigns, has shown unprecedented power. And this is because it highlights the deeper truth, which is that we have to remember that occupation ultimately harms the position and legitimacy of Israel in the world. Only real and effective solidarity in taking direct action can forge the bonds of trust and brotherhood or sisterhood, even amongst Jews and Palestinians, that is so necessary to any paradigm of collective, democratic, and non-exclusive existence in the region.
I thank Madam Clemesha Clemesha, for that presentation on the role of the academic institutions in promoting peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Their initiatives indeed give us hope. As civil society and in other sectors as well, we're very happy again to have you with us. Thank you. I'm using the language of the future, of course.